the effect on the food supply of climate change is already happening. The notion that it's some abstract kind of period in the future is really a deep misunderstanding of, I'm afraid to report, of what's already occurring in farm fields across the world, because there are a number of phenomena that are occurring simultaneously. Well, let me put it another way. Heat rises, as we know. The temperature is rising all across the earth, and that includes in some of the most important food-growing lands across the planet. At the same time, the patterns of rainfall are being dramatically altered. And what that means is that the rain is not falling in the patterns that it used to. In fact, it's breaking all sorts of pattern records. Scientists have determined that you can no longer predict the future in terms of rainfall based on past patterns. They've actually gone back thousands of years of hydrological history and determined that basically now we've reached a point, and now being in the last essentially 10 to 15 years, when they're actually really noticing this profound shift, that the past patterns of rainfall, the past patterns of variation in the rainfall are completely out of sync with what we're experiencing now. So now we have high volatility when it comes to rain. Generally speaking, less rain is falling when it used to, and more rain is falling in intensive downpours, which actually lead both to floods, but also lead to the kind of inundation of crops that are not accustomed to getting this kind of level of water at one time. So what we're seeing is high stresses on the agricultural system in regions across the world. For those two factors, conditions, water, heat, and third, the things that follow those conditions, which are new diseases and new pests that are following those new conditions. So pests that used to be limited to the southern, to south of the United States, for example, meaning in Mexico or Central America, are moving into the southwest of the United States, even as far as the Midwest, because it's getting warmer. Bugs that used to be killed off by the onset of winter are surviving because it gets cold later. Some tree crops that need for it to get cold in the December, for example, in California, cherries and other tree crops need to get cold in December in order to slow down their metabolism so that 3 or 4 months later they can come bursting forth with all those delicious fruits and flowers, which we happen to see. We love the cherry flowers. Well, it turns out it's not getting cold enough to actually retract, so that the yields on those cherries and the qualities of the cherries in California, which is where I'm from, is depleting, as well as in the other tree fruits. So already in the Central Valley of the United States, in the Midwest of the United States, in the Dakotas of the United States, elsewhere in the world, Southwest China, big food-growing area of China, Northern Africa, big food-growing area for North Africa and the Middle East, Southern Europe, Italy, Southern France. They're all feeling these pressures, which means yields are declining, and this is a situation that the world is facing now. We know what it's about. It's only going to accentuate until we find a way to actually grow crops differently, grow different types of seeds than we currently rely on. The hidden costs of climate change are so massive, and they're in so many different sectors of society that it just takes an understanding of how to understand the basic phenomena of climate change to actually then begin to comprehend where the hidden costs are. So you have a record-setting pace of extreme events like hurricanes. Right here in Long Island, we have, where I am right now, you have the extreme events of hurricanes. Hurricane Sandy, which was devastating, cost tens and tens of billions of dollars to the government to help homeowners and citizens to reestablish themselves. Now, what's important is nobody claims that climate change caused Hurricane Sandy. That is not the case. We've always had hurricanes. We've always had tornadoes. We've always had many other natural disasters. What is clear, according to the evidence and according to what the scientists tell us, is that when a hurricane happens, it is going to be far more intense than it would have been without these climatic alterations. What's happening in the atmosphere is getting saturated with more and more carbon dioxide. It's holding the heat closer to the Earth. It can't respire as this kind of organism, Earth as an organism respiring. And so that creates enormous imbalance in the atmosphere, which leads to more intense storms, more intense rainfall and sporadic bursts, and that accentuates the damage, the heightened damage from extreme events. So one way to think of the hidden costs of climate change are the amount of money we have to spend to help people recover from those extreme events. You have Hurricane Sandy here, you have Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, tens of billions of dollars. The California drought, which has cost billions and billions of dollars. You have the crop insurance ratios that have been skyrocketing. Crop insurance payouts by the publicly supported crop insurance system, supported by us taxpayers, has been skyrocketing, practically doubled over the years between 2010 and 2020 in the billions and billions of dollars. And the USDA, our own U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is not exactly some radical bomb-throwing eco-radical organization, ascribes a large portion of those costs to climate change. The USDA did before the current administration, during the Obama administration. It's very clear. So that is a hidden cost. Have you ever thought about crop insurance as a consequence of climate change that you are paying? Because we pay into the U.S. government, the U.S. government pays out to farmers. Countless consequences of climate change amounting essentially hundreds of billions of dollars. The Navy now considers climate change a major threat to its infrastructure, even in counter to the Trump administration's position on climate change, which is a non-position, which is a climate denial administration. But the Pentagon, which actually has to have a realistic eye on the conditions of the Earth. The Defense Department has to understand the world as it is, not as it would like it to be, not infused by some ideological desire system. And so now the Pentagon, in conflict, in contrast to the president, is saying that climate change continues to present a major threat both to its infrastructure, but also as a national security threat because of the increased flow of migrants who can no longer sustain themselves on land that is being altered by climate change, for example, in Mexico and Central America. And in Europe, it's a similar concern, although it's not the Pentagon, it's the European version of the Pentagon sees this is a big national security question. So the cost, for example, of the cost for adapting naval facilities that are based on coastlines amounts to billions and billions of dollars, which now the Pentagon even acknowledges is a result of climate change. There's another hidden cost. So the reason why it's important to acknowledge the hidden costs of climate change, which is the subject of my book, The End of Stationarity, and I talk about all the multiple levels of hidden cost to climate change in that book. For the most part, when we engage in this discussion about climate change, about a consideration of what to do, how to respond to climate change, there's this false sense, I think, of we have the status quo here, which costs X, Y, Z. We pay our taxes, costs the government, costs businesses, costs individuals X. to just maintain the status quo. But if we were to act on climate change by reorganizing the grid, by shifting our power sources to more renewable sources, et cetera, we would be having to pay this, which creates this illusion that it's more expensive to actually face climate change, when in fact, these costs right here have been hidden for years, and they come up much closer to the actual cost of dealing with climate change. So it's very important to realize the actual, real impacts financially as well as physically of climate change, acknowledge those costs, and then make an informed decision. And that's what my book, The End of Stationarity, is about, is identifying what those costs are and how we can deal with them. Climate change is a national security issue for the United States, identified by the United States Department of Defense, which lists climate change as one of the top national security challenges to the United States. And this, by the way, includes the current Department of Defense, current being 2018, in which the Department of Defense has taken a very different position on climate change than the President of the United States. The President, as most people know, is a climate denier. He has chosen not to respond to the evidence that is mountainous by now, and for his own ideological reasons. The Pentagon, which has to actually follow the world as it is, and these are professionals in defending the United States, and they have to see where the threats actually lie. Not where they want them to lie, but where they actually lie. And they have identified now for the past several years that climate change is one of the major security threats for a number of different reasons. Number one is the threat it presents as a physical threat to the military installations themselves, which are facing increasing flooding and inundation, particularly ones on the coast, and there are a lot, particularly in the U.S. Navy. Two is the threat that it presents to the borders of the United States, because the United States is bordered, particularly on the southern border, on Mexico and Central America, and that we could be facing increasing waves of migrants who can no longer sustain themselves on land that has been dramatically, the conditions of which have been dramatically altered by climate change. So they see the immigration flow not from a politically loaded or ideological point of view, but as something the U.S. has to face and has to deal with, this idea that people are getting dislocated from their land and may be compelled to move north. And they also see that basically the struggle for resources in countries that even have less ability to respond to climate change will intensify in places, for example, that are experiencing serious stresses of water or serious heat increases. There's a lot of thinking now that the conflict in Syria, in addition to having its roots in a brutal dictatorship that ruled for many, many years, people's response to that, there was also a long-standing drought in Syria, which really actually put a huge damper on the ability to grow food in Syria, which created extra tensions in a country where power was so skewed that if you were connected to the government, you got food. If you weren't connected to the government, it was more difficult to get food, created the tensions that led to this explosive and brutal situation, which has actually drawn the United States into that conflict. So the Pentagon sees these links that scientists all over the world have been identifying. And I think if we don't act on climate change, we're going to see these links to our national security intensify.